The air inside the Cook County family court was freezing, carrying that sharp, sterile, unforgiving chill that seems to seep through your clothing and lock directly into your marrow. They were trembling. I am Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I have spent the last 4 decades building a commercial real estate empire in Chicago from absolutely nothing. But in that agonizing moment, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, I looked exactly like the broken, senile, deteriorating old man they were desperately trying to prove I was. Across the center aisle from me sat Cynthia today. She was dressed for a funeral. She wore a modest, dark navy tailored dress, her hair pulled back into a simple, severe knot, completely stripped of the lavish diamonds, custom jewelry, and exclusive European designer labels I had generously purchased for her over our decade together. He was holding up a thick, leather-bound medical file, brandishing it toward the presiding judge like a loaded weapon. He was speaking with a grave, resonant baritone voice, declaring to the open court that my cognitive condition had deteriorated with catastrophic, terrifying rapidity over the last 6 months. He read from a stack of heavily curated and entirely fabricated psychiatric evaluations, stating that my mind was completely unhinged, that I had suffered profound memory loss, that I was prone to sudden, violent emotional outbursts, and that I had become an immediate, direct physical threat to my family, especially to my 10-year-old biological daughter, Lily. I was fighting for my basic human freedom and my right to exist in the open air. If the presiding judge believed this Oscar-worthy performance, if that heavy wooden gavel came down in Cynthia's favor, I would be legally stripped of all my rights. I would be placed under a permanent, comprehensive conservatorship, locked away inside a closed, high-security psychiatric ward, treated like a prisoner trapped inside my own failing mind, while she and her accomplices systematically liquidated every single asset I had bled for 40 years to build. The transition was seamless and terrifying, dragging my consciousness right back to the exact moment my entire reality shattered into pieces. It was exactly 3 months ago. I was sitting at the head of the massive mahogany conference table in the primary boardroom of my company, Caldwell Development. The room was surrounded by towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows, offering a sweeping, panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, a vibrant steel and concrete skyline that my company had helped shape and construct over decades of relentless ambition. I was in complete, undisputed control of my domain. Then, without any prior warning, the heavy double-glass doors of the boardroom swung wide open. It was not my trusted executive secretary who walked into the sanctum. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room, and stated loudly, "Harrison Caldwell, you have been served." The silence that fell over that expansive boardroom was absolute and deafening. It was an emergency petition for divorce filed by Cynthia, accompanied by a court-ordered emergency restraining order barring me from setting foot on my own residential estate and a preliminary injunction freezing my personal checking and savings accounts. The formal declarations inside the document alleged that I was mentally unstable, deeply confused, prone to unprovoked rage, and entirely incapable of making rational decisions regarding my personal safety or property. The sheer, staggering humiliation of being served with an emergency psychiatric restraining order in front of my entire board of directors was not a random legal maneuver. It was a precise, calculated, surgical strike. I remember the chaotic, deafening rush of blood pounding in my ears that afternoon. I remember the desperate, frantic drive back to my residential neighborhood, gripping the steering wheel with sweating palms, praying to any power above that it was some kind of horrific misunderstanding, a catastrophic clerical error, or a malicious legal prank initiated by a bitter competitor. But there was no mistake. I looked away from the silver-haired judge and focused my piercing gaze entirely on Cynthia. I looked down at her hands, resting gracefully on the plaintiff's table. They were perfectly manicured, steady, and poised, and now, those were the exact same hands holding the legal knife pressed firmly against my throat. I looked back at the thick, fabricated medical file her lawyer was waving in the air, and then down to my own trembling, shaking fingers. My brain, my memory, and my analytical instincts were my greatest assets. Was I truly losing my grip on reality? Were the terrifying memory lapses real? The strange, unexplained episodes of aggression that Cynthia constantly described to me, You slowly begin to second-guess every single word that leaves your mouth, every thought that crosses your brain, and every step you take across the floor. But the freezing, predatory coldness in Cynthia's eyes, when she dropped her theatrical act for that split second, told me a completely different story. It told my instincts that the rhythmic trembling in my hands was not a disease, nor a natural decline. It was a symptom of something far more sinister and intentional. I just needed the space, the clarity, and the time to prove it. My mind drifted back again to that fateful afternoon 3 months ago when I fled the Caldwell development building. I ignored the speed limits, ran 2 red lights with my horn blaring, my heart hammering a frantic, chaotic rhythm against my ribs. As I sped down the highway, my racing mind sifted through 1,000 different explanations, desperately trying to justify what had just happened. I told myself that Cynthia loved me, that we had built a comfortable, harmonious life together, and that she would never willingly destroy my reputation without some terrible misunderstanding or bad legal advice. There had to be a rational explanation. The ancient, towering oaks that usually welcomed me home, with their sprawling branches, now seemed to cast long, menacing, hostile shadows across the pavement. I pulled up directly to the tall, wrought-iron security gates of the property, a sprawling, multi-million-dollar stone estate that I had purchased, designed, and owned outright, long before Cynthia ever entered my life. A harsh, angry red light blinked back at me. Red light. I tried Cynthia's personal combination. Red light, red light. The entire security system had been completely wiped and reprogrammed from the inside. They had not merely locked the gates to prevent me from entering. They had meticulously and surgically erased my entire physical presence from the property. Before I could fully process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the heavy mahogany front door of the main house opened slowly. I instinctively held my breath, expecting to see Cynthia stepping out onto the porch, perhaps looking apologetic, perhaps ready to explain whatever temporary madness had seized her mind. Instead, stepping out onto the stone steps was Derek. Derek is 42 years old, Cynthia's son from her first marriage. When I married Cynthia 12 years ago, Derek was a lost, directionless young man drowning in credit card debt and drifting from one failed venture to another. Because I loved his mother, I took him under my wing. 5 years ago, against the explicit warnings and reservations of my senior business partners, I appointed Derek as the chief financial officer of Caldwell Development. I gave him a plush corner office, an annual salary of $350,000, and the literal keys to my corporate kingdom, because I believed in his potential and treated him as if he were my own biological flesh and blood. Derek walked slowly down the long cobblestone driveway, his posture relaxed, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored charcoal slacks. He did not look angry, he did not look nervous or ashamed. He let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking his head gently from side to side. "Dad," he said, his voice soft, hushed, and dripping with manufactured sympathy. "You shouldn't be out here driving yourself around in your current condition. You could easily have an accident." I grabbed the cold iron bars with both hands, my knuckles turning white as I shook the gate. "What condition, Derek?" I demanded, my voice trembling violently with a volatile mixture of shock, confusion, and mounting rage. "Open this gate right now. Where's your mother? What in God's name is the meaning of my personal belongings sitting out on the cobblestone like trash?" Derek took a calm step forward, reaching through the iron bars and placing his warm, smooth hand directly over mine on the metal. "The doctors have confirmed that your mind is rapidly deteriorating, Dad," he murmured in a soothing, rehearsed tone. "We've all seen the alarming signs over the past 6 months. You simply aren't well anymore." I felt a paralyzing, icy chill wash from the top of my scalp all the way down to my shoes. I stared through the dark bars at the man I had raised and supported, desperately searching his eyes for even a single hint of a bad joke, a flicker of remorse, or a trace of basic human gratitude. There was none. There was only a hollow, calculating, absolute calm. "I am perfectly fine," I said, my voice dropping from a desperate shout to a low, dangerous growl. "You have absolutely no right to do this to me. This is my house. This is my deeded land. I built and paid for every single brick you are currently standing on." Derek offered a sad, patronizing smile, tilting his head with rehearsed pity. "I know you genuinely believe that right now, Dad, but your perception of reality is slipping further away every day. The legal paperwork has already been processed and signed by a judge. The court reviewed your recent medical history and agreed that an immediate structured intervention is necessary to prevent catastrophic harm. Just go to the hotel and rest. His words struck me like physical blows to the solar plexus. He was systematically weaponizing the very symptoms I had been quietly struggling with, twisting the strange, unusual fatigue, the dizzy spells, and the trembling fingers that had mysteriously plagued me over the last few months into an ironclad legal narrative of irreversible cognitive decay. He and Cynthia were staging a coup right in broad daylight, using my unexplained physical decline as the ultimate justification to strip me of everything. I wanted to reach through the narrow bars, grab him by his expensive silk tie, and throttle him until he told the truth. I wanted to scream until the entire neighborhood heard me. But as my muscles tensed to shake the gate again, my eyes instinctively darted past his tailored shoulder, looking past the driveway toward the second-floor windows of the main mansion. There, standing behind the thick glass of the corner bedroom, was a small, fragile figure. It was Lily, my 10-year-old biological daughter, my sweet, brilliant little girl. Her young face was not confused, nor was it calm. It was pale, drawn, and twisted with pure, unadulterated terror. She looked exactly like a helpless prisoner trapped behind hostile lines. I immediately opened my mouth to call out her name, to shout across the courtyard that her father was right here, that I was not crazy, and that I would never, under any circumstances, abandon her to these people. But before a single syllable could escape my dry throat, a dark shadow loomed abruptly directly behind Lily in the bedroom window. It was Cynthia. I saw the distinct flash of my wife's diamond ring and her manicured hand as her fingers clamped down roughly onto Lily's small shoulder. Cynthia did not even bother to look down at me, standing at the gate. With one violent, sweeping motion of her arm, she grabbed the heavy gold-tasseled velvet drapery and yanked the curtains completely shut. The window went dark. The visual connection to my only daughter was severed in a fraction of a second. I stood there completely frozen on the asphalt outside the gates. Derek turned slowly away from the iron gate, tucking his hands back into his pockets, and walked casually up the cobblestone driveway toward the grand entrance without glancing back even once. He stepped inside the house and pulled the heavy mahogany door shut, leaving me completely alone on the outside of my own existence. My entire life had been systematically dismantled and stolen in the span of an afternoon. I was 70 years old, standing alone on the street beside a pile of luggage with trembling hands and a spinning head, stripped of my corporate empire, my home, and my family. The heavy oak doors of the estate remained firmly closed, sealing me out of the reality I had spent 40 years meticulously building. A private black car service arranged and prepaid, no doubt, by Derek to ensure my swift, quiet, and dignified removal from the affluent neighborhood eventually pulled up to the curb beside my suitcases. The rhythmic tremor in my right hand was now spreading upward into my arm and chest, a deep, internal vibrating hum of pure nervous panic and physical disorientation. The drive back into downtown Chicago was a chaotic blur of flashing gray pavement, towering skyscrapers, and red brake lights. I was deposited at an upscale, highly secure, but entirely soulless executive long-stay hotel located right in the bustling heart of the financial district. The front desk concierge handed me a pre-activated electronic key card with a rehearsed, sterile smile of professional pity, clearly informed by my stepson that I was an ailing, confused elder requiring gentle handling. Walking into that expansive corner suite on the 20th floor was like stepping directly into a high-end, climate-controlled mausoleum. The walls were painted a flat, uninspired uniform beige. There were no family photographs on the walls, no familiar sense of home, no history, just pristine, vacuumed carpets, heavy blackout curtains, and the deafening, oppressive, continuous hum of the central air conditioning unit, blowing cool air from the ceiling vents. I dropped my heavy overcoat onto the stiff fabric sofa and stood motionless in the dead center of the living room. The isolation of the space was immediate, total, and deeply terrifying. Now, there was nothing around me but absolute, sterile silence. I slowly turned and looked at the 6 leather suitcases and 4 bankers' boxes neatly stacked by the entryway by the hotel bellhop. They were shaking violently. The tremor was not simply a temporary nervous reaction to the emotional trauma of being evicted from my home. It was a deep, rhythmic, mechanical spasm deep inside my muscles that I could not suppress, no matter how intensely I focused. I stared at my own aging fingers, commanding them with every ounce of my willpower to remain still. They flatly refused. The meticulous psychological manipulation, the months of gaslighting by Cynthia and Derek, was taking deep root inside my fractured psyche. I closed my eyes tightly, and the disturbing memories they had weaponized against me in the legal filings began to replay across my mind in vivid, terrifying detail. 6 months ago, the strange mental fog had first started creeping into my brain. I had stood there stammering and sweating in front of 30 executives for what felt like an eternity, until Derek smoothly stepped forward and announced the man's name, effortlessly rescuing the meeting while casting a look of deep concern toward me. Then came the sudden, unexplainable episodes of volatile anger. I had felt completely detached from my own actions, like a helpless passenger trapped inside a vehicle that had been suddenly hijacked by an aggressive, violent stranger. And then there were the debilitating physical symptoms. The sudden, paralyzing bouts of late-night vertigo that would strike me out of nowhere, forcing me to grip the polished wooden banister of my grand staircase, just to keep from falling headfirst down the steps. I remembered blinking through a thick mental haze, looking down at the shattered blue and white porcelain fragments scattered across the hardwood floor, while Cynthia cowered against the corridor wall weeping inconsolably, telling me that I had blindly swept the vase off the table in a terrifying fit of unprovoked rage because the hallway lights were too bright. I had absolutely zero memory of doing it, but the broken pieces were lying right there at my feet, and my wife was trembling in fear of me. Sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, that accumulated fear completely paralyzed me. What if they were telling the truth? The agonizing thought of accidentally harming Lily, my sweet, innocent, vulnerable little girl, made my stomach heave with violent physical nausea. Perhaps Derek and Cynthia really were making the excruciating, heartbreaking decisions necessary to protect me and the family legacy from my own madness. The absolute isolation of the hotel room amplified every single lingering doubt, turning the quiet space into an agonizing echo chamber of my own worst fears. Suddenly, the sharp, shrill ring of the hotel telephone on the bedside table shattered the heavy silence. I jumped, my heart hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs. I stared at the blinking red light on the plastic receiver for several seconds as it rang once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Finally, my trembling right hand reached out and lifted the handset from the cradle. "Hello?" I rasped into the mouthpiece, my throat dry, my voice sounding incredibly weak, thin, and defeated. "Harrison, darling," a soft voice murmured across the line. It was Cynthia. Her voice was not the cold, hollow, metallic whisper from the courtroom, nor the impatient, aggressive snap she had used when yanking the bedroom curtain shut on Lily just 2 hours ago. It was her absolute softest, most tender, and most loving cadence. It was the voice of the devoted woman I had married 12 years prior, dripping with profound emotional exhaustion, genuine heartbreak, and overwhelming sorrow. "Harrison, I am so incredibly sorry," she breathed, her voice cracking gently. "I am so sorry that it had to happen this way today. Are you okay at the hotel, darling? Did the car service get you settled into the suite comfortably?" I gripped the plastic receiver tightly, my knuckles aching. "You locked me out of my own home, Cynthia," I said, my voice shaking with raw emotional pain. "You dumped my clothes onto the cobblestone driveway in front of the neighbors. How could you possibly do this to me?" I heard a ragged, wet, trembling sniffle on the other end of the line. She was weeping softly into the receiver. It sounded so agonizingly real, so perfectly calibrated to break my heart. "You left me no choice at all, Harrison," she whispered, her voice trembling on every syllable. "I cry myself to sleep every single night, watching you deteriorate like this. But you have become so aggressive lately, darling. I have to protect Lily, you know, as her father, that my absolute first duty is to keep our daughter safe." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing with devastating tenderness. "You were screaming in the hallways again last week, Harrison. You threw furniture. The house is simply not safe for a 10-year-old child when you are having your aggressive confusion attacks. We live in constant fear of what you might do next when the sun goes down. Her words were like pure venom coated in sweet golden honey, slipping directly through my ear and poisoning my deepest insecurities. I closed my eyes tightly, a single tear escaping down my weathered cheek. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Cynthia," I whispered, my spirit cracking under the weight of her guilt. "I would never want to hurt my family." "I know you don't, darling," she replied gently, soothingly. "We all know that the real Harrison would never hurt us. Derek is sending over the formal temporary conservatorship authorization papers with a courier tomorrow morning. It is just an administrative formality. Harrison, please, darling, just sign the papers when Derek brings them. Do it for Lily's safety. Give yourself peace." The telephone line went dead with a soft, final click. I slowly lowered the plastic receiver back onto the bedside cradle. I stared into the glass at the reflection staring back at me. I looked exactly like the senile, broken, tragic burden that my wife had just described over the phone. The fight drained out of my body completely. I lowered my head in total surrender. I stood up from the edge of the bed, my right hand pulsing with a deep, mechanical tremor as I crossed the carpeted floor and opened the door. Derek stood outside in the quiet corridor, dressed impeccably in a custom charcoal Italian wool suit, with a top-grain black leather portfolio tucked under his arm. His face contorted into a deeply practiced mask of profound agonizing pity and filial concern. He stepped across the threshold, without waiting for an invitation, and closed the door firmly behind him. "Dad," he breathed softly, his voice pitched perfectly to sound like a devoted son tending to an ailing parent. "Look at you. You look completely exhausted. Have you managed to get any sleep since arriving at the hotel?" I bowed my head and walked slowly back to the round glass-topped dining table in the corner of the room, sinking heavily into one of the stiff armchairs. Derek sat across the table and unzipped his leather portfolio. "I am so sorry to bother you with mundane company business right now, Dad," he murmured, his dark eyes conveying a mournful sympathy that seemed entirely genuine on the surface. "I know you desperately need to rest your mind, but the firm cannot stop turning. We have routine weekly payroll approvals and several quarter-end vendor contracts that our commercial lending banks require the senior partner to personally authorize. It is just administrative red tape and bookkeeping." I tried to focus my gaze on the dense stacks of paper he spread out across the table. My vision swam before my eyes, the black ink blurring across the white legal pages. A dull ache pulsed behind my forehead. Derek reached into his breast pocket and slid a heavy, gold-plate Mont Blanc fountain pen across the smooth glass surface toward me. "Just sign right where the yellow adhesive tabs are marked, Dad," Derek whispered softly. "I will personally handle all the filing and bank couriers. You don't need to stress your brain with any of the financial details right now. Just focus entirely on recovering." I reached out to pick up the fountain pen. My fingers and wrist shook with such violent intensity that the heavy gold barrel slipped from my grip and clattered loudly against the glass tabletop. I stared down at my trembling hand lying on the glass as if it belonged to a complete stranger. As I sat staring at my shaking fingers, a vivid memory ripped through the chemical fog, clouding my thoughts. 35 years ago, I stood out on a frozen construction lot on the industrial south side of Chicago at 5 o'clock in the morning. The wind chill off Lake Michigan was 20 degrees below zero. I stepped into freezing, waist-deep sludge alongside the union laborers, screeding fast-curing concrete with raw blisters across my calloused palms for 12 continuous hours without a break. I had built Caldwell Development out of the frozen mud and stone of Chicago with hands that never trembled and never broke. And now, sitting in a hotel suite, I could not even pick up a pen to sign my own name. The contrast between the man I had been and the helpless shell I was becoming was physical agony. I squeezed my eyes shut, commanding my nervous system with every ounce of stubborn pride to steady itself, and finally gripped the cold metal of the pen. Derek stood smoothly from his chair across the table and walked around to my side, placing a comforting hand on my left shoulder. "Take your time, Dad," he murmured. "There is no rush at all," as he leaned forward over the glass surface to point toward the first yellow signature tab, the tailored sleeve of his suit jacket pulled back slightly. And right there, centimeters away from my weary eyes, My gaze caught a brilliant flash of metallic deep blue and polished platinum. I stopped breathing entirely. Wrapped securely around Derek's left wrist was a Patek Philippe Grand Complication Celestial, featuring a dark blue sapphire crystal dial that mapped the exact astronomical movement of the stars and moon phases across the northern sky. It was a masterpiece of Swiss horology that retailed for no less than $500,000 on the private market. That single visual discovery cut straight through the heavy haze that had clouded my judgment for half a year. The mathematical contradiction hit my mind with the impact of a sledgehammer. Derek was my chief financial officer, earning a generous base salary of $350,000 per year. Even with his annual performance bonuses, there was no legitimate financial universe where my salaried stepson could casually purchase and wear a $500,000 Patek Philippe Grand Complication on a Tuesday morning. He was wearing more than his entire annual before-tax salary strapped around his wrist while bringing routine payroll approvals to a hotel room. That glaring financial discrepancy washed over me like ice water. The comforting tone of his voice, the sorrowful eyes, the entire carefully constructed narrative that I was suffering from irreversible early-onset dementia, it all clashed violently against the unexplained wealth, ticking away inches from my nose. A fierce spark of pure suspicion ignited inside my consciousness. This was not early-onset dementia. This was not biological brain decay. I kept my head lowered, allowing my right hand to shake and spasm violently as I pressed the gold nib against the signature line. I dragged the ink across the heavy paper, leaving a pathetic, jagged, illegible scrawl across every yellow tab marked across the 5 documents. I played the exact, tragic part that he desperately needed to see. "There you go, Dad," Derek whispered carefully, his voice thick with quiet relief as he slid the signed documents out from under my pen and packed them back into his portfolio. "You did great today. Just rest your head. I'll check on you again soon." He patted my shoulder, turned around, and walked toward the hotel room door. As the solid latch clicked shut behind him, I heard Derek whistling a light, cheerful tune in the corridor, the unmistakable sound of a young man who had just hit the lottery. I looked down at my shaking hands resting on the table, and my heart turned into solid ice. 2 agonizing days passed before my corporate defense attorneys managed to secure a formal court order granting me a single 60-minute supervised visitation with my daughter. We were assigned a corner bench near the children's playground in Millennium Park, under the constant observation of a licensed county social worker. I arrived an hour ahead of schedule, ignoring the biting autumn wind blowing off Lake Michigan. Out stepped the stern-faced county social worker, holding a clipboard, followed immediately by Cynthia. And right behind her mother was Lily. Cynthia walked 2 steps behind her, her rigid posture and large dark sunglasses radiating a suffocating hostility across the park. The social worker approached my bench first, reciting strict rules with bureaucratic indifference. No discussions of the divorce proceedings, no questions regarding her living arrangements at the estate, and exactly 60 minutes of normalized interaction. Cynthia took up a position 10 feet away, leaning her shoulder against the wrought iron fence around the playground swings, crossing her arms tightly and watching us like a hungry hawk circling a field mouse. I knelt down on the cold concrete as Lily approached my bench, offering her the warmest smile I could muster. My sweet girl," I said softly, reaching out. "I have missed you so very much." Lily stopped 3 feet away from me. She stood frozen on the path, her young face pale and drawn, her wide dark eyes darting nervously past my shoulder to check Cynthia's position. "Hi, Dad," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the dry autumn leaves scraping across the pavement. We sat together on the wooden bench, while I deliberately turned my broad shoulders to block as much of Cynthia's direct line of sight as physically possible. I asked her about her 4th-grade teacher and the books she was reading, but she answered in flat, single-syllable whispers, her small thumbs picking nervously at her cuticles until they bled. When I gently laid my hand over hers to stop the picking, Lily flinched involuntarily, heavy tears welling in her eyes as she fought to hold them back. "You know how much I love you, Lily, right?" I whispered softly into her ear. "No matter what strange things are happening right now between Mom and me, you are the single most important person in the entire world to your father." I am right here. Lily nodded slowly, quickly wiping away a tear with her yellow wool sleeve before glancing back in terror toward her mother. The 60 minutes evaporated instantly. The county social worker tapped her watch. That is all the time allocated for today's session. Mr. Caldwell, it is time to say goodbye. I stood up from the bench, forcing my face to remain composed, so my grief would not be weaponized against me in court. I will see you again very soon, my sweet girl, I promised her. I will never stop fighting to be with you. Lily stood completely paralyzed for 2 agonizing seconds. And then, breaking through her suffocating fear, she lunged forward with sudden speed, throwing her arms around my waist and burying her face into the thick wool of my overcoat. I dropped to both knees on the dirty pavement and held her close against my chest. But right in that brief, fleeting second of embrace, while my overcoat completely shielded her body from Cynthia's watchful eyes, Lily's tiny right hand slid rapidly under the flap of my overcoat and jammed her fingers deep into my inner breast pocket. She pushed something small and folded into the silk lining with practiced, desperate speed. Before I could even process the movement, Cynthia's sharp voice cut across the open park. That is quite enough, Harrison. She marched across the walkway, clamped her manicured hand around Lily's arm, and physically peeled my daughter away from my embrace. Lily dropped her head in complete submission as her mother pulled her toward the waiting SUV. The vehicle doors slammed shut, and they disappeared into the Michigan Avenue traffic. I walked briskly across the park, into the public concrete restrooms near the recreational pavilion, locked myself inside the last corner toilet stall, and reached into my inner breast pocket. My fingers pulled out a small, crumpled square of lined notebook paper torn hastily from a school spiral binder. I unfolded the paper against the top of the metal dispenser under the flickering fluorescent light. Written in dark pencil in Lily's jagged, terrified 10-year-old handwriting were 7 simple words. Daddy, do not drink the orange juice. Those 7 words struck my chest like a cannonball. I stood frozen in the damp toilet stall as a profound clarity settled over my entire mind. For 6 long months, I had been drowning in a sea of manufactured confusion, second-guessing my sanity, and slowly accepting the terrifying narrative that my brilliant mind was rotting away from early-onset dementia. But my courageous 10-year-old daughter had just handed me the master key that unlocked my entire prison. The primal gut instinct that had guided me through 40 years of corporate warfare roared back to life. The mental fog and tremors had first appeared exactly 6 months ago, to the very week that Cynthia returned home from a holistic wellness retreat in Sedona with a custom-blended, liquid herbal cardiovascular supplement designed specifically for aging executives. She had wept softly in our bedroom, begging me to take the liquid drops every day to prevent a heart attack. Like a blind, trusting old fool, I had relented without asking a single question. The evening routine quickly became an unbending ritual. Every night, exactly 60 minutes before bed, Cynthia would prepare a crystal glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, strictly insisting on mixing the bitter liquid drops into the juice herself. She had explicitly forbidden our live-in housekeeping staff from ever pouring or serving my evening beverage under any circumstances. That nightly orange juice ritual was not an act of marital devotion. It was the careful, patient administration of high-grade chemical poison. I cross-referenced my physical symptoms against the hourly timeline of that orange juice. The heavy, suffocating brain fog and confusion absolutely never struck me during the middle of the business day. It always began rolling into my mind roughly 30 minutes after drinking Cynthia's juice late at night. The severe memory lapses and violent episodes like the broken antique Ming vase. I had zero memory of smashing where toxic neurological misfires, caused by whatever sedatives and neurotoxins she was systematically pouring down my throat. I opened my eyes and looked down at my bare hands held out flat under the harsh restroom lights. For the past 3 continuous days ever since Cynthia and Derek had locked me out of the estate gates and banished me to the hotel, I had been drinking nothing but bottled spring water and black coffee. I had not consumed a single drop of Cynthia's nightly orange juice for 72 hours. I held my hands perfectly still. My fingers were rock solid. There was not a single vibration, not a single twitch. The violent shaking that had caused me to drop Derek's fountain pen just 24 hours earlier was rapidly fading away. My central nervous system, freed from the daily chemical assault, was slowly repairing itself. The natural withdrawal of the poison from my tissues was already well underway. I turned on the cold water tap above the rusted sink full blast and washed my face, scrubbing away every lingering trace of the defeated old man who had sat crying on the park bench. The gray, sunken complexion cleared, replaced by a sharp, focused, predatory intensity. I carefully folded Lily's torn notebook paper back into my inner pocket, right over my heart. My daughter had risked her safety to save my life. Now it was my absolute duty to completely destroy the monsters who threatened her. I returned to my hotel suite, right as the sun dipped below the horizon. At 2 o'clock in the morning, knowing that Derek and Cynthia were sound asleep inside my mansion across the city, I opened my laptop and typed in my hidden read-only ghost credentials, 77 Alpha Zeta 9. Decades ago, long before Derek ever entered the firm, I had hardwired a subterranean backdoor access point directly into the deepest architectural layers of Caldwell Development's master financial ledgers, a digital safety net utilizing dynamic proxy encryption that bypassed every standard executive firewall. I pulled up the executive signature authorization queue for the 5 heavily encrypted PDF documents I had signed for Derek 24 hours earlier under the guise of routine payroll approvals. My blood ran freezing cold as I read the fine legal print. They were absolute, irrevocable executive authorizations draining $15 million out of Caldwell Development's primary corporate operating accounts into 3 Delaware shell entities: Apex Strategic Solutions LLC, Horizon Global Management Corp., and Pinnacle Advisory Group Inc. All 3 zero-employee shell companies had been incorporated in Delaware exactly 6 months ago, during the exact same week that Cynthia brought home her custom liquid heart supplement and initiated my nightly orange juice ritual. Derek was systematically bleeding my life's work dry, while keeping me heavily sedated and confused in a hotel room, engineering the perfect corporate embezzlement, while framing a dementia-riddled old man to take the absolute entirety of the federal legal fall. Less than 48 hours later, I walked into the downtown conference room of their high-priced litigation firm for a mandatory preliminary mediation session. When Cynthia and Derek adjourned the mediation session, with concealed smirks of professional victory, completely convinced that I was ready to surrender my empire without a fight, I stepped out onto Michigan Avenue and shed the act instantly. Under a secure alias, I provided complete venous blood samples and a half-inch cluster of root hair follicles clipped from the base of my scalp. Since human hair follicles act as pristine biological historians, growing out at roughly 1/2 inch per month while permanently trapping foreign chemicals, my hair test would scientifically chart the exact week the poison was first introduced, cementing Cynthia's nightly orange juice ritual into an irrefutable, court-admissible timeline of domestic chemical assault. By 10 o'clock that night, I drove back to the decaying industrial outskirts of the south side of Chicago, pulling up outside a rundown 24-hour roadside diner beneath a buzzing red neon sign. Sitting inside the farthest corner vinyl booth was 72-year-old Mitchell Reed, my original corporate founding attorney from 40 years ago, who had written the original articles of incorporation for Caldwell Development. Derek and Cynthia completely believed Mitchell had retired a decade ago to Florida. In reality, he maintained an unlisted, highly exclusive private legal practice from a secure townhouse for a handful of founding Chicago titans. Mitchell reviewed my transaction printouts across the Formica table, his pale blue eyes narrowing with cold, hardened legal fury as he examined Derek's $15 million Delaware shell transfers. "They are bleeding your operating capital out right through the jugular," Mitchell rasped, withdrawing a fresh yellow legal pad from his battered leather briefcase. "And we are not going to simply block their conservatorship motion. We are going to build a legal guillotine right in the center of the Cook County Family Court." Mitchell outlined our master strategy. Before the courts opened tomorrow morning, he would quietly draft an irrevocable master protective trust, transferring my entire remaining personal fortune and residential estate deed directly into the trust structure, with himself designated as sole legal trustee. The exact moment Derek and Cynthia attempted to access my personal accounts or execute a property lien, they would slam headfirst into a reinforced brick wall. And while Derek panicked and accelerated his corporate embezzlement, Mitchell, leveraging his deep, personal contacts inside the Federal Banking Commission and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, would file a classified Level 1 emergency federal banking alert. Every single bank account, offshore routing channel, and digital signature associated with Derek would be placed under covert, real-time tracking monitors, transforming every keystroke into direct federal evidence that would add 10 years to their mandatory prison sentences. I shook Mitchell's calloused hand and drove 10 minutes further south to an abandoned shopping mall parking garage, meeting Victor, a former elite military intelligence operative and counter-surveillance specialist. I handed Victor $20,000 in crisp $100 bills, alongside architectural blueprints of Caldwell Development and Derek's vehicles. By 6 o'clock the next morning, Victor had breached the high-security executive parking garage overnight, planting microscopic, burst transmission voice-activated trenders inside the leather headliner of Derek's sports car, and directly inside the air conditioning intake duct above Derek's executive corner office desk. On the 5th morning of my hotel isolation, my disposable prepaid phone vibrated across the glass table. It was Dr. Aris calling from the Independent Toxicology Clinic in Indiana. His voice was heavy, serious, and somber as he delivered the finalized laboratory results. Mr. Caldwell, our mass spectrometry analysis across both your venous blood and root hair follicle clusters confirmed that what you are experiencing is absolutely not early-onset dementia or natural neurodegenerative decline. Dr. Aris stated precisely, your blood plasma and central nervous system are heavily saturated with a complex, escalating cocktail of dual-action toxins. Dangerously high concentrations of industrial heavy metals, specifically thallium and inorganic arsenic, combined with massive repeated traces of a high-grade, off-market synthetic hypnotic sedative. The heavy metals had been carefully administered to destroy my motor control and induce severe physical tremors, while the altered synthetic sedative crossed the blood-brain barrier to suppress frontal lobe function, obliterate short-term memory formation, and induce acute paranoia and brain fog. And the chronological timeline, mapped across my hair shaft, confirmed the exposure began exactly 6 months ago, with dosages exponentially increasing toward the scalp root. If you had continued ingesting that specific nightly chemical cocktail for another 60 days, Dr. Aris warned with chilling finality, your cardiovascular system would have suffered complete collapse, triggering sudden cardiac arrest. And even if your heart had survived, the synthetic sedatives would have caused permanent, irreversible chemical brain damage. You would have been left trapped in a state of nonverbal dementia for the rest of your life. 45 minutes after disconnecting the call with Dr. Aris, Victor tapped 3 times across my hotel door and placed a matte black USB drive directly onto the center of my glass dining table. 72 continuous hours of unfiltered, master-quality audio extracted from Derek's corner office ducts and sports car headliner. Victor rumbled before disappearing into the hallway. I plugged the drive into my laptop, entered my decryption sequence 77 Alpha Zeta 9, located a high-priority recording captured inside Derek's corner office at 11:40 on Friday night, and connected my studio headphones. I heard the heavy mahogany door shut, followed by the metallic click of the brass deadbolt, locking firmly from the inside. And then came the whispering. It was Cynthia, her voice low, husky, breathless, and saturated with a depraved, deeply intimate familiarity as she murmured Derek's name. I froze completely in my chair as the headphones captured the wet, heavy sound of an intimate kiss across the room, followed by the rustle of silk brushing against heavy leather upholstery. My 45-year-old wife and my 42-year-old stepson were carrying on a repulsive, incestuous physical affair directly across the surface of my executive desk. They moved across the Persian rug, knocking a crystal decanter off the desk to shatter across the floorboards, while laughing softly about discarding their clothing across my chairs. Between heavy breaths, Cynthia whispered about how pathetically gullible I was to stand in our study every night and drink her poisoned orange juice, while Derek praised his mother for being such a brilliant sociopathic actress. A violent wave of nausea surged from my stomach. I ripped the headphones off, stumbled into the hotel bathroom, and emptied my stomach into the porcelain bowl. When I washed my face with freezing water, and looked into the mirror 20 minutes later, the grieving, heartbroken husband was completely dead. I walked back to the dining table, put the headphones back on, and listened to the rest of their master plan. Over tumblers of 18-year-old scotch, Derek detailed his negotiations with Sterling Horizon Group, my oldest, most ruthless commercial real estate rival. Derek was arranging to sell Caldwell Development's entire multi-billion-dollar commercial portfolio to Sterling for literal pennies on the dollar, deliberately tanking our valuation by fabricating quarterly losses. In exchange, Sterling Horizon Group was quietly wiring him exactly $20 million in untaxed offshore kickbacks into encrypted accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. To push the sale past the senior partners without interference, they needed my permanent, irrevocable legal incapacitation. Next Monday morning, in exactly 5 days, a specialized private medical transport team, coordinated by Cynthia and a heavily bribed, corrupt private psychiatrist, would enter my hotel suite, inject me with clinical sedatives, and forcefully transport me directly to a locked, high-security state psychiatric asylum located 3 hours outside the city under strict communication blackouts. Once I was locked behind steel doors and stripped of my identity, Derek would sign over the property deeds to Sterling, and on Friday they would board a private charter out of O'Hare to permanently relocate to a multi-million-dollar luxury villa in a lawless, non-extradition coastal territory in South America. And just before the recording ended, Derek asked about covering every remaining loose end. "What are we doing with Lily?" Cynthia let out a sharp, derisive, soulless scoff that turned my blood to ice. "Don't waste a second worrying about that pathetic little brat," she sneered. "The exact instant the old man is locked in the asylum on Monday, I am executing my sole legal authority as her custodial mother. I have already signed and paid for her permanent enrollment in a high-altitude, locked juvenile disciplinary boarding school located in the Alps just outside of Geneva, Switzerland, equipped with ironclad communication blackouts. And if the Swiss Academy refuses to keep her before our flight to South America on Friday, I will simply sign over my parental guardianship rights directly to the Illinois state foster care system and dump her into an overcrowded state group home." Every single lingering trace of hesitation evaporated from my soul instantly. I picked up my disposable phone and called Mitchell Reed. "Mitchell," I commanded with absolute, freezing authority. "We are changing the timeline right now. They are planning to ship Lily to a Swiss disciplinary prison or dump her into the state foster system on Monday. Spring the federal banking trap today. We end this in open court tomorrow morning." The very next morning, I sat slumped right in the center of the defendant's table inside the cavernous, high-ceilinged Cook County family court, wearing my wrinkled charcoal suit with my chin bowed low toward my chest. Across the aisle, Cynthia and Derek sat at the plaintiff's table, looking like the picture-perfect, heartbroken aristocratic family, completely convinced they were walking into a routine, 15-minute judicial rubber stamp to finalize my permanent conservatorship. They had absolutely no idea they had just stepped inside a federal slaughterhouse. The presiding silver-haired judge peered down from his elevated wooden bench, while Cynthia's litigation attorney, Harrison, formally submitted the heavy petition, alongside the forged psychiatric evaluations of sudden-onset dementia. When the judge requested a primary character witness, Derek Caldwell walked with confident dignity up the steps into the witness box, raised his right hand high, swore a binding oath before God and the court under the severe criminal penalties of perjury, and took his seat. For 20 minutes, Derek committed massive, deliberate felony perjury right on the stand under oath. His dark eyes welled up with practiced, manufactured tears as he wiped his cheeks with a white handkerchief, swearing before the judge that I had wandered the estate, screaming at non-existent intruders, and physically lunged at nursing staff. He begged the judge with open palms to grant the permanent conservatorship immediately, so they could transfer me to a specialized clinical facility. And I sat in absolute silence, letting him dig his own federal grave 10 feet deep, knowing that Mitchell Reed sat just 5 feet behind me in the gallery holding 40 hours of audio, certified toxicology reports, and federal banking freeze notifications. The presiding judge let out a heavy sigh of judicial pity, gathered the thick stack of conservatorship orders, and raised his heavy wooden judicial gavel high above the sounding block. He was exactly one fraction of a second away from bringing the gavel down when a clear, high, determined young voice rang out across the chamber from the heavy double doors at the back of the gallery. "Wait, please wait." Every head inside the courtroom swiveled toward the back gallery. Standing right in the center aisle, clutching her pink digital tablet tightly against her chest, beside a county child welfare caseworker, was my 10-year-old daughter, Lily. "May I please show you something that my dad doesn't even know about, Your Honor?" Lily asked loudly, her young voice trembling slightly, but carrying clearly across the silent room. Cynthia shot upward out of her chair with explosive, frantic panic. Her mask of the weeping wife disintegrated into wide-eyed terror as she let out a sharp scream and lunged bodily across the center aisle, clawing her hands out to physically snatch the pink tablet away from my daughter's chest. She never made it across the aisle. The armed, 6'4" county bailiff intercepted her with military speed, stepping smoothly into her path, placing a broad hand flat against her chest, and pushing her forcefully backward until she crashed heavily back into her chair at the plaintiff's table. "Sit down right now and remain completely silent, ma'am," the bailiff commanded, with thundering judicial authority. The presiding judge slowly lowered his wooden gavel, his eyes narrowing with sharp, calculating judicial scrutiny as he noted Cynthia's sweating terror and Derek's frozen posture in the witness box. "You may approach the bench, young lady," the judge said gently, ignoring Attorney Harrison's frantic objections. "Bailiff, please assist the child in connecting her electronic device to the courtroom video monitors." The armed bailiff connected Lily's pink tablet directly into the courthouse's central multimedia display network, and 4 massive, high-definition digital monitors suspended from the high ceiling flickered to life. Lily pressed play across her screen. The high-definition video began broadcasting across the 4 giant screens, captured directly from the hidden camera inside the glass eye of Lily's brown stuffed teddy bear perched high above the kitchen fruit bowl in my suburban stone estate. The entire crowded courtroom watched in breathless, spellbound silence as Cynthia walked into frame wearing her emerald silk nightrobe, reached behind ceramic mugs inside the cabinet, and withdrew a hidden dark amber prescription vial. A collective, horrified gasp echoed across the gallery as the monitors showed Cynthia dumping large white tablets directly into a heavy marble mortar and pestle. The sensitive kitchen microphone captured the sharp, grinding crunches of the stone pestle as she vigorously crushed the lethal synthetic sedatives into a chalky powder, scraped every single grain into a tall crystal glass of freshly squeezed orange juice alongside clear drops from an industrial eyedropper bottle of arsenic and thallium, and stirred the cocktail with a silver spoon. Before she could carry the glass out, Derek walked right into the frame of the camera in his tailored charcoal suit, sliding his arms possessively around his stepmother's waist. The entire courtroom watched in sheer, open-mouthed revulsion as Cynthia turned around in his arms and kissed him passionately across the marble island, a deep, prolonged exchange of physical intimacy that publicly shattered their fabricated mother and son relationship before the world. Derek pulled back slowly from the disgusting embrace, looking down at the tall crystal glass of tainted orange juice with smirking, predatory satisfaction. Once the old man's brain completely rots away from this, Derek laughed across the high-definition video feed, his voice dripping with concentrated malice. "I will sign the entire estate and the corporate holdings directly over to you." The video ended abruptly, and the 4 massive monitors turned pitch black. The cavernous courtroom was plunged into an absolute graveyard silence. The presiding judge sat completely frozen high upon his wooden bench, his face drained of color, his expression transformed into a rigid mask of judicial outrage and professional fury. Cynthia trembled violently in her chair, gasping for air with a translucent cadaverous complexion, like a rotting corpse. Derek sat inside the elevated witness box in a state of complete, catastrophic, paralytic shock, his jaw hanging slack as his chest heaved with hyperventilating breaths of absolute terror. Even their litigation attorney, Harrison, physically recoiled, taking 2 large steps backward away from his own clients, as if they carried a lethal biological plague. I stood up slowly from my heavy oak chair at the defense table, my spine straight, my broad shoulders squared with 40 years of reclaimed iron strength. I gave a single, firm nod toward Mitchell Reed sitting in the gallery. Mitchell stood up smoothly, walked directly into the well of the court, and dropped a 4-inch thick stack of certified legal, scientific, and federal documentation directly onto the center of the presiding judge's elevated wooden bench with a resounding thud. "Your Honor," Mitchell announced, his powerful baritone silencing the chamber. "These exhibits I have placed across your bench are the certified forensic toxicology reports from the Independent Toxicology Clinic, confirming chronic, lethal concentrations of industrial arsenic, thallium, and off-market synthetic sedatives inside my client's blood plasma and root hair follicles over a 6-month exposure curve. Alongside them are 40 continuous hours of high-definition audio recordings capturing both petitioners conspiring to commit first-degree murder, detailing their ongoing incestuous relationship, and outlining their illegal $20 million corporate wire fraud." Mitchell tapped the folder firmly against the wood. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the $15 million in corporate operating capital that the co-petitioner, Derek Caldwell, attempted to siphon into Delaware shell accounts over the past 2 weeks has already been intercepted, frozen, and seized by the Federal Banking Commission under classified alerts filed by my office 72 hours ago." Before Attorney Harrison could even open his mouth to withdraw as counsel, the heavy double oak doors at the very back of the courtroom burst wide open with a violent crash. 4 stern-faced, heavily armed federal special agents from the Financial Crime Enforcement Network and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, accompanied by 2 senior detectives from the Chicago Police Department Homicide Division, marched with precise military formation right down the center aisle of the courtroom. Derek took one look at the federal badges and tactical sidearms entering the well of the court, and his nerve completely shattered into blind panic. He scrambled frantically out of the wooden witness box, jumped over the wooden railing, and made a desperate sprint toward the side emergency exit door. He did not make it 3 yards across the carpet. The armed 6'4" county bailiff lunged forward from his post with incredible speed, tackling my 42-year-old stepson bodily to the polished marble floor with a heavy, bone-crunching thud. 2 federal agents swarmed over him instantly, pinning his arms violently behind his back and ratcheting heavy, steel double-locking handcuffs tightly around his wrists. Cynthia collapsed backward into her chair at the plaintiff's table, her aristocratic facade completely destroyed. She began weeping hysterically, crying and screaming across the room as she looked toward me, begging and pleading for mercy with that same sweet, honey-coated, manipulative tone she had used over the telephone. "Harrison, darling, please tell them. It's all a horrific misunderstanding. I love you, Harrison. Please don't let them take me away." I stood completely motionless, my face carved from solid granite, watching in freezing, absolute silence as the destruction of her existence played out before me. The presiding judge brought his heavy wooden gavel down across the sounding block with a thunderous crack that shook the chamber. "Order in this court!" the jurist roared with righteous judicial fury. "The petition for temporary and permanent conservatorship is hereby summarily denied and dismissed with prejudice. All temporary property injunctions, asset freezes, and restraining orders previously granted to the petitioners are revoked and vacated immediately across the record." The judge signed a formal judicial order across his blotter with slashing strokes of his pen. "Furthermore, this court hereby grants immediate, sole, exclusive, and permanent protective legal custody of the minor child, Lily Caldwell, directly to her biological father, Harrison Caldwell. And based upon the overwhelming video, forensic, and audio evidence presented before this bench today, I hereby sign and execute immediate federal and state criminal arrest warrants for both Cynthia Caldwell and Derek Caldwell on open charges of attempted first-degree homicide, felony racketeering, international wire fraud, and aggravated perjury under oath." I stood by my defense table in cold silence and watched as the federal agents hauled Cynthia roughly out of her chair, snapping heavy steel cuffs around her wrists right beside her frozen litigation attorney. I watched as Derek, the arrogant boy whom I had rescued from poverty, mentored in my home, and foolishly trusted with my life's legacy, was dragged bodily across the courtroom floor in absolute, sobbing, humiliated tears. They had eagerly picked up golden shovels to dig a quiet grave for a senile old man, only to dig their own inescapable federal tombs. With the federal agents clearing the treacherous monsters from the chamber, I slowly turned away from the defense table and walked across the well of the court toward the clerk's desk, where my 10-year-old daughter stood holding her pink tablet. I dropped down onto both knees right across the polished marble floor, opening my broad arms wide. Lily dropped her tablet and ran straight into my embrace. I wrapped my arms tightly around her small frame, pulling her securely against my chest, burying my face deep into her dark hair as she wept tears of overwhelming relief across my shoulder. The suffocating chemical darkness that had plagued my mind for 6 agonizing months was finally and permanently lifted, replaced by the bright, cleansing light of absolute truth. I had lost a treacherous wife and a backstabbing stepson to their own boundless arrogance. But through vigilance, patience, and the courage of a 10-year-old girl, I had saved my own life, reclaimed my billion-dollar corporate empire, and protected the only family on this earth that truly mattered. Betrayal rarely arrives upon your doorstep, wearing the face of your sworn enemies. Trust is a profound, beautiful foundation, but blind, unquestioning trust is a lethal, dangerous liability. Always keep a firm, calloused hand securely placed upon the steering wheel of your own life, your corporate finances, and your physical health. And the exact, precise moment that someone attempts to isolate you, gaslight your mind, or lock your gates for your own good, that is the exact moment you must stand up and fight back with every single ounce of strength inside your soul. Protect your hard-won legacy, protect your mind, but above all else, fiercely protect the innocent children who look up to you and depend upon your strength.